it's Ingrid and welcome to my June wrap-up. I read a total of 7 books and no graphic novels. This is actually the first month this year that I didn't read a graphic novel. Hopefully that will change in July, but I'm going to be wrapping up the 7 books that I did read. So first I'm going to go over some stats from my bullet journal, and my ratings this month was really good. I read 4 5-star reads, 2 4-star reads, and 1 1-star read. And I read 4 fantasy books, 1 horror book, 1 contemporary, and 1 sci-fi. 14% of the books that I read was by a male author, and 86% of the books that I read were by female authors. So I'm gonna wrap it up starting from the first book I finished to the last book I finished. I'm gonna do it in chronological order. So the first book I finished was Caravelle by Stephanie Garber. This was a reread for me, and I decided to try the audiobook. So I started the audiobook, and then I read a little bit of the physical one, and then I went on holiday, so I finished it in the audiobook. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars the first time I read it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars the second time I read it. This book follows 2 sisters, Donatella and Scarlett, and it's written from Scarlett's point of view, which is the older sister, and it's about this, I don't really know how to explain it. It's like a festival, magic show, carnival type performance called Caravelle, and so it's about these sisters going to Caravelle and things happen. I highly recommend this book, but it's not for everyone. The magic wasn't really explained, but if you're the type of reader that likes to get carried away, likes to just get lost in the story, I guess, I really think you should pick this one up. And I really like the sibling relationship as well. I have an older sister, and so I could really relate to the sibling aspects of this story. And there was kind of a mystery to it, and it was just so good. There was so much unexpected things and a lot of plot twists. And also one of the guys in here, called Julian, is probably the only fictional crush that I have. I really love this book. And the reason why I reread Caravelle was because the second book in this trilogy just came out, and so I wanted to pick that one up. So the second book that I read this month was Legendary, the sequel to Caravelle. So I won't talk too much about the plot of this because I don't want to spoil anything in the first book. But if you like the first book, I would highly recommend this one. It still has the magical element, it still has a mystery, but I felt like you got more answers out of this. It answers a lot of the questions we didn't get answered in Caravelle. It leaves you with a few new questions, but I think we got a bit more of an understanding. Kind of what I felt lacking in the first one was that like the magic system was a bit more explained, and I really like this book. I did the same thing with this. I listened to some of it on audio and I read some of it on ebook because I was on vacation, so I didn't bring my physical book with me. It was really good, and I can't wait to reread this series again next year before the third and final book comes out in this series. So I mentioned earlier that I was on vacation, so I went to visit my boyfriend that lives in Australia, and while we were there he got me a book because, you know, he's the greatest boyfriend ever. So he got me Neverland by Margaret McGovern, I think is how you pronounce her name. So this is also an Australian author, and a release that I think came out earlier this year sometime. And so he got me this one, and it ended up being my favorite book of all time. If I didn't mention, I gave Legendary 5 out of 5 stars as well. I absolutely loved it. As I said, my favorite book of all time, hands down. As you might have seen from the title, it's a Peter Pan inspired book. It's not a retelling, but it's definitely inspired by Peter Pan. And before reading this book, Peter Pan used to be my favorite book of all time. So I instantly knew that I would like it because of that element, but also because it's a mental health book. So we're following our main character, Kit. The story starts when she tries to kill herself, and her uncle runs a mental health school slash hospital on this island that they call Neverland. So he takes Kit with him, and she gets put into this mental hospital school. And it's just about recovery and friendship and relationships, and it's just so good. If you like reading about mental health, I definitely think you should pick this one up. It had a really heavy recovery aspect of it, which was what I liked the most. I will put out a few trigger warnings. It deals a lot with PTSD, a lot of graphic self-harm, suicide, and it has some eating disorder in here and bad relationships. So it's definitely a heavy book, but if you think you can handle it, I highly recommend picking this book up. Now, I don't think that this book is necessarily a favorite for everyone. The reason why it's my favorite book of all time, and I think it will stay that way, is just because I went through a lot of the same things that Kit went through. I suffered a lot with PTSD, and I've just felt like this book really represented that, and I haven't seen myself in a book character like this ever. And so yeah, I gave this obviously a 5 out of 5 stars. And then the next book I picked up, unfortunately, was my 1-star read of the month, and that was City of Ashes by Cassandra Clare. And this is the second book in the Mortal Instruments series. And I didn't really love the first book, which is called City of Bones. Yeah, the first book is called City of Bones, and I didn't really love that one. I gave that one 2 stars. I wanted to continue because I do want to see the show, and like everybody loves the series and they keep saying that it gets better, but I just, this just wasn't for me. It was just boring, and I don't like the characters. I like Jace and Magnus. Those are the only 2 characters that I care about. Alex and Isabel are fine. Like, I don't really care what happens to them, but they don't annoy me. But Claire and Simon are just insufferable. Like, I don't care about what happens. I honestly kind of wish that they would just not be a part of the story. And there's just so much stupid thing that happens in here. I understand that these are supposed to be young teenagers, but they just make no sense. Especially the main character, Clary. She would just do things that would it just does not make any sense. They would literally tell her, do not do this, and on the next page she will go and do that. And it was just not enjoyable, and there was a little bit of girl hate in this. Is definitely unhealthy relationships. I just didn't like it that much. I will probably continue the series because I've already purchased the 3rd one. I do like the premise of this book. I just didn't think it was executed that well. So I gave this one a 1 star, unfortunately. The next book I picked up, I borrowed an e-copy from my library, but I do own the physical book. And that's Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shannon McGuire. And this is the 2nd book in the, I think it's called Wayward Children series. No, there are 3 books out, and the first one is called Every Heart a Doorway. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because I don't want to spoil the first book, but the first book, Every Heart a Doorway, is about kids that go to different portals into different worlds, kind of like Narnia and Alice in Wonderland, like those types of worlds, and then they come back to our world and have a hard time just readjusting to everyday life. And this follows 2 of the characters who meet in Every Heart a Doorway, and it's kind of their backstory, and we get to see them going through their portal and their life in this other world, and it's really, really good. It was really dark, which I liked, I'm gonna be honest. But the one thing I love the most about this series is just the writing style. It just reads very whimsical, kind of like a fairy tale. I just really like the way that she writes the story. So we'll be continuing this series. There's 1 more book out, and then there's 1 more coming in January. And I believe that there's going to be even more books in this series. So yeah, I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. And then I decided to pick up an audiobook, so I read Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Noel. I'm probably butchering that name so bad, but I believe he's Canadian and it's like a French name. I'm not too sure. So this is a sci-fi story that is composed of different files, and the series is called the Themis Files, and it's just a series of like interviews, a few diary entries, a little bit like the Illuminate Files, but not to that extent. It's just mostly in interviews, and it starts out with this girl when she's young, probably like 8 to 10 years old, around that, I don't really remember, and she falls into this big giant hand, and we jump forward in time where this woman that was the child that found the hand ends up researching this hand and tries to find all the other pieces to figure out what this thing is. And it's a really, really entertaining book. It's an adult sci-fi, so it was definitely a lot of gruesome things happening. It was graphic. I really enjoyed the full cast audiobook, and I would recommend reading the audiobook. And I end up giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. And the reason why I didn't get that 5-star rating was just that I didn't really care about the characters all that much. And I think maybe that the reason why I didn't connect that well was because of the way it's told with interviews and stuff. It was just we didn't really get to hear their thoughts, more like their conversations. But I did really enjoy it still, and I will be continuing the series. I believe that it's a trilogy, and I believe all 3 books are out. So I will definitely be continuing with the audiobooks because I really like that experience. So the 7th and final book that I read this month was Lost Boy by Christina Henry. And this is a Peter Pan retelling, and it's from Captain Hook's perspective, but before he was Captain Hook. So it's about Jamie being a part of the Lost Boys and how he ended up being Captain Hook. And so this is actually a fantasy horror book, and it was amazing. If you like Peter Pan, I highly recommend reading this book. Even if you're only seeing the Disney version of Peter Pan, I still think you would enjoy this book. You don't have to have read the original Peter Pan, even though I've read it many times because it's one of my favorite books. But I highly recommend this one. As I said, it's a horror, so there's definitely some gruesome graphic things in here. It was just amazing. I really liked Jamie, and at the end of this book I did cry, full on cry, because I did not want him to end up as Captain Hook, even though we know that's what's gonna happen because we know this is the backstory of Captain Hook. But it was so gripping. I really cared about all the characters, and it was just such an amazing ride. Now I will read you just the prologue of this book, because when I first heard about this book I went to my local bookstore and I read the prologue and I had to buy it because it really hooked me. The prologue goes, "Once I was young, and young forever and always, until I wasn't. Once I loved a boy called Peter Pan. Peter will tell you that this story isn't the truth, but Peter lies. I loved him. We all loved him. But he lies. For Peter wants always to be that shining sun that we all revolve around. He'll do anything to be that sun. Peter will say I'm a villain, that I wronged him, that I never was his friend. But I told you already. Peter lies. This is what really happened." If that doesn't get you hooked, I don't know what will. I cannot recommend this highly enough. If you want to know Peter Pan's backstory, even though it's not like an official story, I highly recommend picking this one up, and of course I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that was all of the books that I read in June. I am very happy with all the books. I had an amazing reading month except for that one book, but we'll just not talk about it. I hope that you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on this book, and if you want to continue hearing my thoughts on books, then please subscribe, and then I will see you in my next one. Bye!